Greetings one and all. I am here to talk about what might be the most explosive, controversial, text-critical variant in the entire Old Testament. I feel kind of bad making this video because I feel like I'm baiting on a controversial issue here. Does this have educational value? Yes, actually I think it does, because it is exciting, it is super interesting, and it does remind us of what the field of textual criticism actually is, so we can have a chance to redefine it, talk about something related to the history of manuscripts, as well as consider an issue at the center of ancient Israelite religion, namely this question of monotheism. So yes, I'm clickbaiting at the exact same time as I'm educating, and you gotta love it, okay? But this is a controversial one, and I expect to see weird comments below. So please don't disappoint. Okay, what is textual criticism? Textual criticism is not criticizing the text. It is the process by which linguists, scholars, archaeologists can sort through the manuscript evidence we have for the Bible, many different manuscripts, long copying process before the printing press, right? Sort through those manuscripts and try to determine as best as possible which text or which wording, or even which individual word, in some cases, best represents what the original author wrote, the so-called autograph of the Bible, the original text. Why don't we just pick up the original text and find that out? Well, because we don't have it, and the very notion of an original text is indeed a troubling one, a problematic one, because A, there's a practical problem. How would we know if we had one? Even if it was like an old scroll and it said by Moses, oh, at the bottom, signed Moses, I wrote it, okay, well, what if someone copied it and copied the byline at the bottom, right? So, really difficult on that front. It's also problematic on a different front, though, which is more technical. I'll just summarize it this way. We know that a lot of the books of the Bible underwent a process of not just copying transmission, but also authorship. Authorship is more complicated in the ancient world, and it may be that these books came together over a series of editions over many dozens of years, many decades, maybe even hundreds of years in some cases. So that complicates the idea that there's a single original version of a book. Does text criticism ever make a difference? Well, 99% of text critical variants are about the spellings of words and about obvious mistakes or words or letters that have dropped out, and we know how to fix it. We know what the intention was. Doesn't really make that big of a difference. But in a few cases, a couple cases, you get something truly spectacular, like in the current case that I want to talk about. It's in the book of Deuteronomy. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 32. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there, or I'll read it to you. Quick review of what is the manuscript evidence we have for a book like Deuteronomy, or for the Hebrew Bible as a whole. The oldest full Hebrew Bible that we have actually is surprisingly late. You may be shocked to learn that it is the so-called Leningrad Codex, which we think, based on evidence within the Leningrad Codex itself, maybe was copied and written out around the year 1008 or 1009 AD. So really only about 1,000 years old. You would have thought that maybe the oldest full version would have been much older, like during the time of Jesus or from 10,000 BC or something. No. It's only from about 1,000 years ago. The Leningrad Codex is thought to be a really good example of a so-called Masoretic text. You can look down in the show notes and see below, and you can see some spellings of these terms in case it doesn't make sense as I'm saying it. Thought to be a really good exemplar of the so-called Masoretic text. What is the Masoretic text? The Masoretes, or traditionalists is how you would translate that, were those who kept the text and preserved it during the medieval period. And they are thought to have worked, I think, between maybe the 6th or 7th century and the 10th century AD. So their work sort of culminated in this gorgeous, or is represented best as a culmination, you could say, in terms of what we have in this Leningrad Codex. We also have another big codex or book called the Aleppo Codex. Aleppo Codex was originally a full Hebrew Bible, but partly got destroyed in the fire. A little bit earlier than the Leningrad Codex, maybe around the 900s, 920, 950 AD, okay? When do we get anything older in Hebrew? Well, you have to go all the way back to the Dead Sea Scrolls to get Hebrew texts. So there's actually a gap between the Dead Sea Scrolls, which a lot of them date to from around 100 BC, let's just say, give or take, into the very beginning of the Common Era. you have nearly a 1,000-year gap there in which we don't really have manuscript evidence of any substance at all, and certainly not full Bibles. So that's amazing. We do have Greek Bibles from that period. Greek Bibles for sure, like the so-called Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest full Bibles that we have in Greek, dates to the 300s AD, but not in Hebrew. So you don't always know from that Greek and from those Greek examples of what we might call the Septuagint, various translations of the Old Testament in Hebrew into Greek. We don't always know what the underlying Hebrew text was, right? We could guess based on how they translated things, sometimes better, sometimes worse. Okay, having laid that background, let's get to the controversy. Deuteronomy 32 begins as a speech from Moses. Moses is reciting kind of like a farewell poem to the group. It's a rather harsh poem. He says a lot of hard things to Israel. Starts off, "Listen, O heavens, and I will speak. Hear, O earth, the words of my mouth." And he goes on to say lots of things. But let's zoom in on verse 7. "Remember the days of old. Consider the generations long past. Ask your father, and he will tell you, your elders, and they will explain to you." I'm reading from the NIV Bible, New International Version. Verse 8, "When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples, according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance." Seems maybe like an unremarkable piece of poetry, but there's something deeper going on here. Even the NIV, which sometimes translates poorly in these types of controversial scenarios, in my opinion, even they have a little footnote, little a, and I check that a down to the bottom. The footnote is on the phrase, sons of Israel. This is where the action begins. Sons of Israel, okay. The note down below says, Masoretic text, says sons of Israel. Semicolon, Dead Sea Scrolls, see also Septuagint, say, sons of God. Sons of God? Like what? Why would some texts, including our earliest version of the text, 4Q Deuteronomy, is what is the kind of coded name for the Qumran scroll in which we have this, why would the earliest version of this, and even some Greek translations, say sons of God? Not bene Yisrael, which is in the Masoretic text, represented in the Leningrad Codex, but rather bene Elohim, sons of God, or even Elohim. Got an earlier video on that. You can check that down below. Not just sons of God, but it could also read sons of gods. In other words, bene, the word ben in Hebrew or bene can mean members of a category of. So in other words, divine beings. Why would we have that variant, and why is that actually explosive, and how would we sort this out? Well, let me just go straight for the jugular on this one. Read in a certain way, the text could seem to be promoting an idea which could seem very foreign to some Bible readers, namely the idea that the Lord, Yahweh, is not the only God in the universe. Let me reread this. In fact, I'm going to go straight to Hebrew here, just so we can look at a couple of terms. Let's reread this with a little bit of a different eye toward a possibility here. This is not like critical scholar moment trying to undermine the Bible, okay? I know you guys some of you have a hair trigger for that kind of issue, but even very, relatively conservative Christian biblical scholars like myself sometimes really want to take a deep dive into these issues and understand, right? Like what's at stake here? What's going on? This is our first task as Bible readers, friends. What is the text actually saying? And this is what text criticism helps us figure out. So you want to get into this, right? I'm looking here at the Hebrew text, and I see this in verse 8. And I'm comparing it here to the translation I see. When Elyon, the Most High, so the word here for God is Elyon, Most High. When Elyon apportioned out the nations, when he divided up the bene Adam, the sons of man, the humankind, he set up the boundaries for the peoples. That's all normal, according to the number of the bene Yisrael. Okay, so first of all, so let me get straight to this. So the idea is, let's read the scene in a totally alternate way, just experimentally, with the bene Elohim, sons of God's reading, not sons of Israel reading. So there's a deity named Elyon, Most High. When this Elyon, he's looking down at the nations and he's like, okay, I'm going to give each nation a god to rule over it, according to the number of divine beings that there are. How many divine beings are there? Well, there are, various kinds of divine beings. And they all should have a nation. And this is indeed a very common sort of world theology, we might say, in the ancient Near Eastern world, that each nation has its god. The Moabites have Chemosh, their god. And the Edomites have Kos, their god. And the Babylonians have Marduk, their god. Israel has the Lord, Yahweh. This is an idea that we kind of see reflected, not promoted necessarily, but just reflected as a common understanding at various points in the Bible. So this Elyon is like the head deity, and he's looking around and he's like, okay, here are the nations. We got to divide up humans. You go to your places. Think like Genesis chapter 10, table of nations kind of stuff. Nations go to different spots. We're going to set up boundaries according to the number of the divine beings. How many gods are out there? 70 gods? Okay, good. 70 gods. Let's have 70 nations. That's how many there are in the table of nations, I think, give or take, if you kind of count them all out, something like that. Or you could just choose 70 as a number, because in the book of Exodus, you have 70 families, 70 sons of Jacob who go down into the Exodus. So it's kind of like one of these biblical numbers beginning with a 7. So let's just say 70, right? 70 gods, 70 nations, everybody gets their nation. Verse 9, for Yahweh's portion is his people. That is, namely, the sons of Jacob, Israel, right? So read that way, in other words, the text is making it sound like Yahweh is one of a number of gods who's been given a nation, in particular Israel. And it's, so they belong together, Yahweh and Israel. But then presumably there are other gods and other nations who have other gods. That's the controversial reading here. Now, that would seem to not match a traditional idea, a key doctrinal idea in Judaism and Christianity of monotheism, that there only exists one God. And note that that is the definition of monotheism. It's not like my God can beat up your God, or like my God's better than your God. That's not monotheism strictly or philosophically. Monotheism says, I have a God and my God can't beat up your God because you don't even have a God. There are no other gods. Okay? So these are different concepts. One might say, yeah, there might be other gods out there. I don't even know. Maybe they're out there. But my God is the best, and I only worship my God. An idea like that you might call monolatry, the worship of a single deity. Okay. Now, you might say, okay, this text critical variant though, sons of Israel versus sons of gods. I mean, some texts say one thing, some another. How would you even know which text to read? Well, here's a concept that you might invoke. The concept called lectio difficilior, which in Latin means the difficult reading. So one principle of textual criticism is that if you have two manuscripts that say two different things, but one of them is actually kind of like a controversial or a hard thing to say, it's much more likely that a scribe or a community would alter that and change it to an easier, more acceptable thing than it is for a community or a scribe to take a very acceptable, normal thing and change it to a really hard thing to understand or to read. Assuming that there isn't a case here that you could say there would be graphic confusion between the words Yisrael and Elohim. I don't think there is. Those words are not graphically similar enough in Hebrew to really mix them up quite like that. So under the concept of lectio difficilior here, we would say it seems reasonable that the earlier, more original text really did read bene Elohim, sons of gods, divine beings, let's say. There's even ambiguity in how you could translate that, right? So we can't sort all of this out. But lectio difficilior and the fact that the earliest manuscript, 4Q Deuteronomy from Qumran, suggests that probably the reading really was sons of gods. So we have to make sense of the text on that basis. When you do that, you can start looking elsewhere in the Bible for this concept of maybe more than one God, and you could find other texts that might get you there. For example, even the Ten Commandments, very famous, right? The Ten Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. What else do you need as a monotheistic statement, right? Well, the text doesn't actually quite say that. The text doesn't say there's only one God that exists. The text actually says, the Lord spoke these things, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery. There shall not be for you, I'm reading directly here from Hebrew in Exodus 20, verse 3, there shall not be for you Elohim acherim al paneh, other gods up in my face. You could translate it literally, al paneh, in my face. doesn't say that there are no other gods that exist. There is a way of saying that in Hebrew. Many of the famous texts like this are in the book of Isaiah, particularly in the second half, but that's not what the commandment actually says, interestingly. Also, you could look at a text like Psalm 82. Psalm 82 is a banger for lots of reasons, a great psalm. But here you have a situation where, again, if just reading it literally and looking at the words, it seems to set up a situation in which there are other gods. And the translation will matter here a lot. The NIV, in my opinion, kind of tries to cover over this, but a translation like the NRSV, I think, is a little more honest about the text. God, Elohim, stands in the assembly of El. So you have a God who's standing in a divine assembly, maybe of other gods. In the midst of the Elohim, gods, he judges, yishpot, he renders judgment. So you have a divine scene in which there are multiple gods. And you have the speaker in the psalm saying in verse 6, Ani amarti Elohim atem. I said, you all are gods, speaking from the perspective of God, Elohim, in verse 2, presumably, verse 1. Looking out and saying, yeah, I admit that you're gods, but, and second half of that verse 6, Uvne Elyon, there's that Elyon again, that Most High, sons of the Most High, all of you. But, ke Adam, like a human, you will die. Something that gods are not supposed to do is die, right? So God here, speaking in the first person in the psalm, is looking out at the divine assembly saying, you haven't done justice on earth. If you read the whole psalm, you'll see this. And therefore you will die, you'll be judged. And then the psalm ends by saying, Kuma Elohim, rise up, O God, rise up and judge the earth. Because, you're the real God, you're the judge of all the earth. This is a situation which seems to be something other than a strict philosophical monotheism. I'm just reading the text here, okay? Are there other ways to interpret these things? Of course, absolutely. I'll link a couple of ideas down below, and you can have a look in your own time if this is something that interests you. How might a Christian make sense of this, or even a faithful Jew for that matter, who's monotheistic, and you see these kinds of things? Here's one idea. I can't give a full exposition of this, but a thought. We see Israel on a journey throughout the Old Testament to get to know God. Indeed, I think any reader of the Bible would have to recognize that that the people of God, through both Old and New Testaments, go on a journey to articulate and understand who God is. For Christians, Jesus Christ isn't revealed explicitly like the Gospels right away in the Bible, right? You got to go through lots of long books together, right? So I think we have to embrace some sense of a progressive revelation that God is revealing God's self in pieces or in time to people. And we have to respect that process, and maybe not all of the finalized pieces are going to be there from the very beginning, but rather we take this journey. And we can't fault the Bible for going on the journey, right? We have to accept it on its own terms, and indeed admit ourselves as people that we go on this journey too to understand truth. We're not there right away. So we can even watch the authors of the text, which in traditional Christian understanding are inspired by God. We can watch them going on this journey as well. Maybe Israel takes a journey toward monotheism, right? And certainly on biblical terms, we take a journey toward Jesus by the very end.